So Transgender Day of Visibility happens to highlight those of us who are in the community that don't normally have that visibility. So it's been around for a number of years. It's always on March the 31st. It's always a place that we can both celebrate who we are, but also to highlight the issues that many of us face.
So what kind of Trans Day of Visibility activities are you involved in this year? I understand there's a bit of a shift in the scheduling this time around.
We're flag raising on Thursday at 9:30 at the CBRM outside the municipal building, because this year the Transgender Day of Visibility falls across Easter weekend, and it's not lost on me that Easter is about rebirth, which is often the case for many who transition and find themselves.
Veronica, what can you tell me about the history of Trans Day of Visibility and how far we've come from those early days? And also what kind of energy you're seeing at the current Trans Day of Visibility event?
So Transgender Day of Visibility first started in 2009 as a response to the invisibility that a lot of us have, and the backlash that we often find ourselves facing. In the last few years, the flag raising events have been relatively well attended, and the energy is good. But given the protests that happened last year, it's becoming more important that visibility for those of us who are willing to be visible is counted. And I know from some of the responses I've got so far that this year's event should be a bit more well attended than it has been in the past. The energy is always good at these events, and I'm always pleased to see the turnout, and I'm always pleased to see how many councillors turn out for it, which is a big piece of this. It's a big piece of that being visible, and that visibility helps others know that we're around.
Veronica, with this in mind, I'm curious as to who you feel really bears the responsibility for protecting and promoting the trans community and those within it. We obviously have some prominent trans Nova Scotians, among them Lisa LaChance, the first ever trans MLA serving on an NDP riding in Halifax. There's also, of course, the actor Elliot Page, who recently presented the Juno Humanitarian Award to Canadian musicians Tegan and Sarah at the award ceremony in Halifax. So is it up to the trans community itself to protect itself and demand its rights? Is it up to cis allies to fight for them? Or do you feel it's a combination of the two that should be speaking up right about now?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Adam. The responsibility for visibility for everybody is everybody's responsibility. And it doesn't matter whether we were celebrating the trans community or we were celebrating other parts of the community. There's an allyship that needs to happen across the community for the community. So I'm well aware that whilst we have the Transgender Day of Visibility, there are other people who need that visibility too. There's a lot of invisible people around, and that invisibility means that a lot of people in the community don't always understand some of those issues that we face. So this is part of the highlighting of this particular part or section of the community is, the pieces of visibility that we do need to because of their influence on various public policies.
Veronica Merryfield, as we speak here in one of the most public parts of Sydney, Wentworth Park, it strikes me that there was a time in your life when you might not have felt safe doing a very visible television interview in a very public place like this. Can you talk a little bit about that to share your perspective on your past?
And again, that's very true. I wouldn't have felt comfortable doing that even 10 years ago. I'm not necessarily sure that I'm always that comfortable being in public. One of the things that does happen for me is that kind of hypervigilance. But I do feel safer being able to do this in a public place today. And I'm hoping that stays the way over the next decade, 2 decades, and that others would feel safe to be able to do that in a way that I know they wouldn't have been able to feel safe doing that in years past.
Does your own determination to make the world a safer place for trans people, especially trans youth, drive you to take on challenges that might have frightened you even a decade ago?
So that again is a good question. What is my drive? And my drive has really been to help those in the community who haven't come out not take their own lives. The suicide rates for the trans community is still quite high, often uncounted, because people don't necessarily know that they were transgender before they take their lives. So anything I can do to help stop those numbers is a good thing. But it's a hard thing too, because I don't see those who don't take their lives, I only ever see those that do. And that makes it all the more difficult, but all the more determination to do this publicly, so that people do feel they have somebody that they can reach out to. And I know it's helped others come out into public life for this very similar reasons.
Veronica, we've talked about your early struggles in terms of recognizing who exactly you were. Can you tell us a little bit about how visibility of trans people in public forums and even just in the general community has changed since that time?
50 years ago, more or less, as a young child, whilst I knew who I was, I didn't see any visibility or representation around me. I didn't know who to go out and talk to. I didn't have anybody else's story that I could look at. It wasn't until my teens that I discovered the musician Wendy Carlos. And her story was published in some of the music magazines that I was kind of perusing at that time, from my own interest in music and electronics. But it was still a while before I felt, I was going to say, comfortable enough to come out, but it wasn't a comfort as you might imagine. I had a stark choice. I could either be who I was, or I could take my life. And it was still difficult then. So that brings us up to about 30 years ago, where the visibility was a little bit better, and I did come across others. But even then it was hard for us to find each other. 30 years ago was the early days of the internet in terms of how public and broad it is now. And those of us who did connect actually connected on an old technology called IRC, Internet Relay Chat. And even that took me a while to find, and it took a lot of people to find because of that piece of public visibility and people being out in public. Post-transition, I obviously knew more people, I got to know more people, but it was still hard, and it was hard for children, particularly children and youth, to be able to find those who were visible, to show them that it would be okay and to find that help they needed. In the last 30 years, that has changed quite significantly, but the shoulders of those that I stand on did a lot of work in the publicity and education, which is why that kind of education is so key and why visibility is so key. It's getting easier in general and has done for the last couple of decades, but I think when you have that rising education, because it's not reaching everybody, there's still a lot of fear and pushback. And we're starting to see more of that now. And I don't always like to be political, but the personal is political. And the right-wing politics that we're seeing creeping up from the US in particular is starting to have an effect. The prospective Canadian politician for the next election has started talking about banning transgender women from certain spaces. And he's also taken to talking about biological sex without really understanding the implications of that. But it's interesting to me that he's picking on transgender women and not picking on transgender men, going to what we would call the transmisogyny that exists out there. And I'm not entirely sure where that comes from in that mindset. When I do talk to people about it, it's usually a misunderstanding. And I do like to talk to people one-on-one about that, because that piece of education is so key, and it's how the education spreads through the broader community.
You and I have talked before about the situation in New Brunswick, where changes to Policy 713 mean that students' identities are no longer protected by school officials. Similar activity taking place last fall with the government of Saskatchewan and more recently with the government of Alberta. Does it cause you concern knowing that, as you say, attitudes and actions against the trans community that we might have thought to be more common to the United States are now actually making their way up to Canada, and then in the case of the Maritimes, hitting really close to home?
Yes, and that again is a very good question. It is close to home. It's a fear for a lot of the community. The school-age children that I do, and youth that I do meet at CSAs in schools are scared of what that might mean. Schools are meant to be a safe place, but to be honest, a family is meant to be a safe space. But if the child knows that their home life is not safe in the same way that my home life as a child wasn't safe in that respect, finding a safe space for them to be able to explore themselves, for them to be able to gain the confidence to know who they are before they have to talk to their parents is a really powerful piece. And taking that away means that those children and youth don't have anywhere safe and potentially can't talk to those of us who've been there, seen it, done it, got the t-shirt kind of thing, to understand what's involved, to understand how that piece of themselves is able to come out. And I think one of the things that probably disturbs me as much as that is people I talk to are in their 60s and 70s who have struggled their entire lives knowing who they are, but not felt safe in society to be able to come out despite that rising education. So there's two ends to this, which is why the visibility is so important, and it's why I took the step to stand up publicly. I've had a good life. I've been able to come out. It's not been without its adversity, but to be able to help others find themselves is such a great experience for me to watch those people find themselves and come out in relative safety. And that safety is something that a lot of us have spent a lot of years trying to create.
As we talk about safe spaces, Veronica Merryfield, it's worth pointing out that you're not only the founder and head of the Cape Breton Transgender Network, but you're also the education coordinator for Cape Breton Pride. With this in mind, could you tell me what you and your colleagues are doing to help educate the community, both inside and outside of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community, about what it's like living as a trans person and how trans people can be protected?
So for me, education is one of those ongoing things. I educate in my daily life whoever I come across. I educate those that I work with that are colleagues, but I also educate when I'm invited to any events that I can. And interesting, last week we had an International Women's Day panel session where I was one of the speakers, and it wasn't news to me that a lot of the things that I go through, others go through too. During the International Women's Day panel, I spoke about how the binary is something that we often use, or is often used in society, to pitch two pieces of society against each other. So very commonly we might talk about men or women. But actually, for a lot of society, it's about what it's not. It's about men and not men. It's about being white or not white. It's about being cisgendered or not cisgendered. And those pieces allow people to see that there is that piece of intersectional discrimination that happens to a lot of us. So education for me is something that's an ongoing process. I get invited to speak to all sorts of different organisations, to work with them, or to provide training events. So it's not so much about what's currently going on, it's about it's always going on.
Now, one of the things that you have going on over the next couple of weeks is that you're making another visit to Halifax to speak to officials with the Department of Health and Wellness on gender-affirming care. This is not your first time making such a presentation. What points are you hoping to drive home to government officials this time around?
So I've been working with the Department of Health's policy team for some while on gender-affirming care. there were a number of changes that happened last year, but there's still more changes that need to happen. So there's some very specific things that I'm interested in changing. So for instance, anyone that's going for gender-affirming surgery in Montreal, for instance, has to put up the money to get there themselves to start with, and then are reimbursed later. That's a significant barrier for some folks who just can't raise that amount of cash, even over a longer term, because of that intersectionality that they face with discrimination over things like employment. So these are the kind of things that I want to see changed in any way that Nova Scotia Health deems appropriate, but certainly being able to provide that level of care should be improved. I've recently heard people talk about why the health service should be covering gender-affirming care at all. And one of the arguments I use, if you're going to go down the financial angle in terms of a government perspective, is what is the cost to the government of not providing that care? So very often those who are transgender, who aren't or are prohibited from seeking that care that they deserve, end up costing the health service in terms of extended mental health care, extended medication. Often they find it difficult to work because of the mental health issues that it creates, and that means that it's a financial cost to the government. Enabling those folks to transition takes away a lot of the causality to that mental health issue that they have, and allows them to function as happy individuals in society and becoming a net contributor to the government coffers. So there's other things from the health perspective. There's still pieces around the gender-affirming care that patients have to pay an overly substantial amount of money for as part of that process that aren't covered under healthcare, that I think should be reasonably covered under healthcare, as one might have found campaigning in history for various other pieces of healthcare. It's also a piece of healthcare that is not terribly well understood, even though it's a fairly significant percentage of folks looking for that kind of care.
So we've talked a bit about your work with the Nova Scotia government on gender-affirming care, and you've also been to Ottawa to make the case for gender-affirming care to the federal government. We've talked just a moment ago about what's happening in other provincial governments, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, Alberta, in terms of trans rights. How do you feel Nova Scotia is doing in this regard?
In much the same way that Nova Scotia was the starting point of colonisation in Canada and Turtle Island, it's also been an interesting starting point for gender-affirming care. Things have been progressing fairly well in Nova Scotia for some years. We're still not on a par with the Yukon, who moved their policies forward very quickly a few years ago to be a complete coverage. But then there's other provinces where things are a lot harder than they are in Nova Scotia. There's limited options still across Canada. So for instance, for surgeries, it's Montreal, Toronto or Vancouver, which means that some of the provinces put that onus on others, put that onus on the community to get to those places. It's okay if you live in Montreal or you live in Toronto or you live in Vancouver, but if you live outside of that, you've still got a lot of work to do. And provinces such as Saskatchewan and Alberta and New Brunswick are making that harder. And I'd like to see that those provinces will start to take the lead from Nova Scotia and the Yukon, which is another reason why I'm pushing, and I'm hoping that the lead that Nova Scotia has had in the past will continue to be had across Canada.
So, as we wind down our conversation and you prepare for the CBRM Trans Day of Visibility activities going on March the 28th, this may seem like an obvious question, Veronica Merryfield, but what do you personally take away from all this, and what do you hope to achieve on March the 28th and beyond?
I guess it is an obvious question. It's a mixed bag of feelings. Compared to my life's journey, I'm really positive with the number of people that do turn out, with the support that there is generally in the community. But I also know that there's a lot of work still to be done. Some of that is challenging, but some of it is really rewarding too. And being able to have those one-on-one conversations with folks who are willing to approach is a really interesting piece. And I'm really happy to share my life story and why it's important that we do support the transgender community.
Well, Veronica, I always feel like we learn a lot whenever I get to speak to you for Telile Community Television. So thank you for giving me some time to talk about the Trans Day of Visibility coming up on March 31st, but the actual CBRM celebrations for Trans Day of Visibility coming up on Thursday, March 28th. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Adam, and it's been nice to film it in Wentworth Park.
Veronica Merryfield is the head of the Cape Breton Transgender Network and the education coordinator for Cape Breton Pride.